Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 80. Have you wanted to create a Python application that goes further than a command line interface? You'd like it to have a friendly interface, but don't want to make it a GUI, graphical user interface, or a web application. Maybe a TUI, text user interface, would be a perfect fit for the project. This week on the show, we have Will McGugan to talk about his projects, Textual and Rich. Rich is a Python library for writing rich text to the terminal with color and style. It's a great tool if you want to display advanced content such as tables, markdown, and syntax highlighted code. We talk about how Will started on the project and how it's developed over the years. We also talk about Will's new project, Textual, a TUI, using much of Rich at its core. He shares how the project is coming along and what are challenges in developing this type of application. We discuss how a TUI has more in common with CSS and web development than command line or graphical interfaces. We also have a quick announcement at the top of the show from CPython developer in residence, Łukasz Langa, about next week's release of Python 3.10. This podcast episode is brought to you by DataStax Astra DB, built on Apache Cassandra, now made easy in the cloud. Get 40 gigabytes of storage free every month at astra.dev/Python. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. So I have a special announcement from an upcoming guest about the release of Python 3.10, and I'll let you take it from there, Łukasz.
Hi, my name is Łukasz Langa. I'm the release manager of Python 3.9 and 3.8. Those are ancient versions by now. So what I would like you to invite you to is the release party of Python 3.10, which is going to be happening on October 4th and led by Pablo Galindo Salgado, who is Python 3.10's release manager. There's going to be me, him, and a bunch of other guests on Twitch. You will be able to comment and celebrate it with us. And as well, just see how a release is actually happening in real time. So again, you're very welcome to attend this with us. Stay tuned for the actual announcement with links. I don't have one yet. It's still upcoming from where I'm standing. But see you on October 4th.
Cool. So they could maybe check out like your Twitter feed or Pablo's feed and get the actual Twitch link at that point.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay, cool. I'll make sure to include all that in this week's show notes, and we'll talk to you soon on an upcoming episode.
All right. See you then.
Okay. So I just received the links from Pablo's Twitter, and I'll include those in the show notes, so check them out there. Now, on to the interview with Will. Hey, Will, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks to be here.
We were talking just before we got started how I had been mentioning your projects a lot in my episodes with David Amos, and we had talked about Rich being used in a lot of these sort of REPL replacement tools. And then we saw the article about the Rich dashboards thing that was like around February of this year.
Yep.
And then with all these interesting developments with Textual. And so I was very excited to get you on to talk about those things. And first off, I don't know if you want to just kind of maybe guess a background on Rich as a project and what it is.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So Rich is a Python library for color, style, and formatting to terminal. So there's numerous objects that you can write to the terminal to produce, rich. I use that word a lot, rich formatting, such as tables, panels, things like markdown. Quite a large library, but it does all these things, and it's all quite integrated together.
Yeah, I really like the... I was looking through some of the documentation and some of the built-in methods and different tools that you have there, like you said, like the tables and just sort of formatting things. What are some examples of libraries that are using Rich right now, or projects that you know of that are using Rich?
There's quite a few. Recently, I found out that HTTPX,
Oh, okay.
that's a Python library which is kind of like next generation requests. They've got a command line application, and they're using Rich there. So if you request an HTTP endpoint, it'll show that with syntax highlighting.
Nice.
For HTML and JSON and such.
Give you a little bit of a step above like the basics of pretty print and things like that.
Yeah, well, this isn't pretty printing per se. This is syntax highlighting of the response. So I'll show you the header with various color and style to make it a bit more clear or easier to read. And the HTML will be highlighted, so you'll have the tags colorized. It makes it easier to scan in the terminal when you're kind of like testing API endpoints.
Yeah, that makes sense. They kind of just be able to see at a glance what's happening and what's coming in.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
What got you interested in creating this project?
So it goes back quite far, actually. I was working on another project of mine, a web development framework called Moya. And in that, I needed a way of writing to the terminal, and I wanted to write content which there wasn't libraries out there to do that. I wanted to format things, insert bold and italic and stuff. And there was a few libraries to do it, but it wouldn't handle things like text wrapping. You write out a sentence, and when it gets to the end, it'll just fold over, and you'll get half a word cropped at either end. So I started writing my own routines to do that kind of stuff, and it got bigger and bigger, and
yeah,
as it does, always does, and it became quite sophisticated. But it was never intended to be used outside of that library. But I do think that it had some good ideas there. Some things that should probably be offered in a sort of independent library. And years afterwards, every time I need to write to terminal, I'd think, I wish that existed. I wish that library existed that I've got in the back of my head.
Yeah.
And after a few years, I think it was more than 4 years, I've been thinking about this library, and it still didn't really exist. There was lots of libraries that wrote various things to terminal. There was libraries that did color, those libraries that did style, those libraries which did tables, several libraries which did tables and syntax highlighting and all sorts of things. And they were pretty good. I had no major issues with these libraries. They were well-written libraries, but nothing which integrated that all together. So I started working on this idea that had been in my head for 4 years, put it together. The first thing I did was console markup. This is my idea of having a string and being able to insert tags, much like HTML, but using square brackets. So I don't know if you're familiar with BB code. It was like BB code. So you can have a tag which says bold on, and then some text and bold off, etc., that kind of thing. So I implemented that, and I found that quite useful. And then I started adding on all the other ideas that I've been thinking about for years, and it grew and grew from there.
Yeah. I've seen it is kind of built into these sort of like different REPL replacements. I think maybe because they can kind of build on top of the syntax highlighting that you're doing.
Yeah.
How's that work? Is it parsing individual words or bits of code and identifying them and sort of grouping them? Or how does that work?
So there's two types of syntax highlighting that goes on. There's pigments-based highlighting. That's another library which does syntax highlighting, and that you give it the string and you tell it the format, and then it's got a parser built in that tokenizes it and gives it colors. And Rich takes that and that information and then renders it. But there's also another syntax highlighting going on, which is something I've created, which uses regular expressions. It works quite well for repr strings. The thing about the output from repr is not a formal syntax. It looks like code, but it isn't really code. If you repr a dictionary, it'll look like a dictionary when it comes out, but you can add custom reprs. So it's not a formal language which you can come up with a grammar for. So for that, I use regular expressions, which seems to work quite well. I can have a regular expression for strings, which picks out strings, and I can highlight those green. And anything which looks like a tag, I can highlight that as a tag. And 99% of the time, that syntax highlighting works quite well.
So Moya, you're using that on like your personal site, right?
That's right. Yeah, my personal site is built on that. Moya has when I think about it, a touch of sadness because no one ended up using it, and I worked on that for 4 years. It's a crazy system. I think it was revolutionary, but no one ended up using it. It uses XML throughout. So my blog stopper, for instance, is essentially written in XML.
Oh, wow. I think there's a lot of people that have maybe mixed experiences with XML.
Yeah.
And I think that they might be shied away from it. Like I personally worked at a bank in mortgages, and a lot of the vendor, like the external software vendors wanted things sent and received in XML.
Yeah.
And so I think I might have had an allergic reaction if I would have heard you saying that it uses XML, which is not nice to say, but I think that, do you think that would be something that affected the uptake of it?
Oh, definitely. You're not alone. A lot of people don't like XML. And I don't think it's necessarily the fault of XML itself. It's the fault of the applications of it, which seem to be very verbose.
Yeah.
You end up writing quite a lot of convoluted XML, which seems like just making the task in hand harder.
Yeah, the nesting was never easy to parse in this case, what I was working with. And again, I was converting from SQL, which has its own its own arcane kind of structural stuff that you need to be comfortable with before you would, kind of come in and out. So I could kind of see as a system, I could maybe see how like it would be easy to convert back and forth between that and HTML.
Yeah, it doesn't. Well, it actually it doesn't use the XML for the output. I think, it's been years since I did this, but I think there are text templates, but it's actually the logic that's in XML.
Okay.
And it's not too verbose. I work quite hard in kind of compressing it into things which are kind of short and expressive. And I did this because I noticed that doing web development, I solve the same problems over and over again.
Yeah.
They're not exactly the same problems. They're not like cut and paste type problems. You write a lot of views and you're essentially thinking to yourself, oh, I've written this dozens of times. So I thought, what if I could have something which was higher level, where I just needed to tweak the things which change and then keep the routine the same. And I found that XML was quite good to express that. It was often better than Python or high level languages.
So it sounds a bit like a take on templating in a sense.
It's kind of like templating. It's templating code.
Okay.
At some level, there's the tags which do if, and for, and else, etc. There's also much higher level tags, which do a lot more per tag.
So go beyond the basics of, say, like a Jinja or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's actually XML's code. It's not really a template. It's Turing complete code. So in a sense, it's not really XML that is running, because XML is just how you put it down. It's just represents the thing. I guess the Moya language just happened to exist in XML, but it was independent of XML. If that makes sense.
Yeah,
it could have a more programming language like representation, but I found XML is quite powerful for this kind of thing.
Yeah, it looks cool. I mean, and your site is beautiful.
Thanks.
In fact, the Moya site is really beautiful. MoyaProject.com.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just send some love that way. Have people check it out because it looks really cool. Were you doing it for multiple reasons? Were there specific things that you needed to solve with it? No,
not really. I was working quite heavily in web development, and I use Django mostly.
Okay.
And there's lots to love about Django. documentation, the community.
Yeah.
But again, I found development very repetitive, and I kind of want to make my life easier and create something which I didn't have to repeat myself quite so much.
Okay. As far as sort of code that was required in each step of the phase of building a Django site, that you had to keep adding these required blocks of things?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of boilerplate. I think my mission as a developer is to remove boilerplate. I think almost at a character for character level, there's things which exist that's for the computer, for the machine.
Yeah.
And things which exist for a human being to express what you want.
Yeah.
And you want to get that, get that balance where you much less code for the machine and more code for the human being.
Yeah.
And I'm not knocking existing systems because they're quite powerful. Django's powerful. It runs loads of websites around the world, and Flask and all these projects. But even so, I think a lot of the code you write is boilerplate. Maybe it's like 1/3 of the code expresses the human being's intent, and the rest is the necessary machinery for the machine to understand it.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and that made me think about the recent Copilot thing. The GitHub Copilot.
Yeah,
how it's not a good thing that it would need to help you with writing all that boilerplate code, but it definitely is something that there's plenty of that code in existing repositories.
Yeah,
so it would definitely be familiar with it.
Yeah, that is interesting. The way it turns natural language into code.
Yeah,
and the code that it generates is much longer than natural language.
Mm-hmm.
If only we could just write software in natural language. I think we're a long way away from it, but
yeah, Python's definitely an expression of that. And then I think things get interesting with web, kind of integrating with web technologies and so forth. And were some of the desires that you had for Moya? I'm sorry, I'm spending so much time on it, talking about it, but I'm very intrigued by it.
No, it's totally fine. Yeah,
you're a photographer. Were there some demands of hosting like galleries and your work and stuff like that? Was that something that this system was helpful for?
A few actually. Yeah, there's quite a lot of support for photography. There's a few tags there which will pull out information regarding the camera and the lens from a JPEG.
Okay, so the metadata type of stuff.
That's right. Yeah, I forget what they call it, but it contains the exposure and the F number for the lens.
EXIF? EXIF?
EXIF, you're absolutely right, yeah. So it can pull that out. I can use that information to render it somewhere in the blog.
Nice.
And there was lots of support for downsizing images and processing images. So I can create thumbnails when you upload an image.
Yeah.
With just a couple of lines. And you can implement effects like blur. In my blog, I've used a few blurry images that load in first. So you can get an impression of what it looks like. And then a second or two later, the high-res image appears.
Okay. Kind of like this is really going back in time, the progressive.
Yeah.
Was it JPEG or GIF, or what was it doing that did the progression?
I think both.
Yeah.
JPEG, there's progressive JPEGs and there's progressive GIFs, I think.
Yeah.
But that's the basic idea, yeah. When you take a very high resolution image and then blur it, even if it's 4K in size, save it as a JPEG, it compresses to something that's really, really small. It might be 60K for an enormous image because it's blurred. So you can load that in first. In the background, load the sharp image, and then at some point do a crossfade. So you crossfade from the...
That's nice.
Yeah.
Because what happens sometimes is it feels like the page is clunkily being assembled in front of you.
Yeah.
And the boxes sort of pop into place, and then the text is moving. You're like, wait, I was starting to read that. Yeah. So you're going to get less of that, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, this is I think mostly solved. I think by just getting faster internet. But the progressive JPEGs and progressive GIFs, if there is such a thing, they looked ugly when they were loading.
Yeah.
Even the JPEGs, I think it loads alternate lines and gets sharper and sharper. It looks janky. It looks computery.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've come up with better ways of solving those, I think. But most sites that load heavy in images will do some sort of progressive loading where they do that crossfade thing, I think.
Yeah. I'm a photographer myself. I dabble quite a bit. I don't know if you call it professional photography. If you're working for an organization, I was shooting like marathons and like side of the road kind of stuff, and then like graduations and other things like that. And it really got me into photography and messing around. But the last 2 years have been a real bummer as far as going anywhere and taking photos.
Yeah.
So yeah,
it really has. I would like to get out and do more photography because it was like the other passion of mine.
Yeah. Do you do much other Python stuff with photography?
No, not really. Haven't had the opportunity. I would like to. It's always good to combine two things that you like to do into one.
Yeah. I had Mike Driscoll on, and he was doing a book about Pillow, the
Pillow,
Python image library. It's interesting the things that it can do. It's still, missing a lot of things like a higher level editor will have, but it does a lot of the stuff that you're talking about of like, okay, I want to crop this or pull the EXIF data out or those kinds of things. So
yeah, Pillow's quite neat. I've used it for years. I don't know how far it goes back. I used it when it was Pill.
Yeah. Okay.
So that must be more than 10 years. I don't know. Must be.
Yeah, totally. This podcast is sponsored by DataStax Astra DB. Astra DB is built on Apache Cassandra and is now made easy in the cloud. Create a free Cassandra database in minutes for global scale on a startup budget with 40 gigabytes of storage free every month. Visit us at astra.dev/Python. That's astra.dev/Python. When you saw, I guess we could kind of maybe you could tell the story of it, but there was this post where somebody had taken Rich and they had kind of created something beyond just a standard command line interface. They'd actually built like a sort of a dashboard.
Yeah.
And I feel like it kind of maybe piqued your interest as far as like maybe a potential area of development. So I don't know if you want to tell the background on that.
That's right. Yeah. So I forget the developers. Hamill. Forgot your surname. And I think it was.
Yeah, I'll make sure to include links.
Okay, and Jeremy Howard. I think that's right. Apologies again, forgot the names. But they took Rich, and they built a dashboard which showed real time information from the GitHub API. So it could show. I can't remember what it showed. Commits and statistics and various things in a dashboard format where it split the screen into 4, and there's a few options to change the layout and such. And they were using Rich for that, but Rich has no support for anything like that. So they had to use it. They had to hesitate to use the word hack because it sounds like doing stuff randomly. But they did something clever to take Rich and to produce more of an application, more of a TUI text user interface. And I looked at it, and it looked great. And then. See, I'd been resisting building anything like that for Rich. Rich was just write some nice output in a static format to terminal so you can make command line applications look nicer. It was never very dynamic. There was progress bars, but that was about it as far as dynamic output goes. And I swore that that's all it would ever be, even though people ask me, well, can I build a bigger interface for this? And I would say, no, that's not what Rich is for. But when I saw a GH top, I thought, well, I have to do it now because I could see the potential for those. I mean, initially I was thinking, I'll build something for those type of HTOP like applications that are more dashboardy. They'll show you some information that's updating, maybe got a few keys to modify the view, etc. And I thought I'd limit it to that. But then I realized that I could extend it a bit further and maybe build something which you can use to create any user interface for things which are more sophisticated, kind of editors and dialogues and real-time plots, that kind of thing. So, that's how it came about, and I embarked on building Textual.
When did you sort of go heads down and start working on that?
It wasn't immediately after I saw GHTop, but I started thinking about it after GHTop, and at some point, just got to get out what's in my head. So it was only a few months ago. I had this intense period of writing code, and it all came to the basic system came together quite quickly. I want to combine it with things that I've been learning about over the last few years, and specifically AsyncIO and web technologies. So it came together. The initial phase came together quite quickly in a matter of months. It must have been like 3 months of working on it. But there's quite a lot of technical debt there. There's quite a lot of code that I wrote that I didn't understand myself.
Inside of Rich to update toward it?
Oh, Rich is used in Textual. Sorry, I should have explained that. So Rich does all the rendering.
Yeah. So, but that's where the technical debt was sort of, if you will, stored away.
Well, Rich is very mature.
Yeah.
But the stuff to make it dynamic, that's where the technical debt was, because I wrote it so fast. Had to get it down on paper or screen, as it were. And since then, I've been going back and cleaning it up and refining it. So I've got a more stable base going forward.
When you mentioned that you needed to have AsyncIO be part of this project, is that partly because it is much more of a user interface?
Yeah. So in a user interface, there's lots of independent tasks going on.
Yeah.
AsyncIO seemed to be the right candidate for that. It's kind of a novel use, I think, for AsyncIO. AsyncIO is more for, I/O. It's in the name, isn't it? It's more for...
Yeah. That's what I'm thinking of is like, the most common thing we end up hearing is like adding it to some web type library so that...
Exactly. Yeah.
Things can kind of be going back and forth. But I think a user interface would be crucial. I mean, input is part of that, right? So
yeah, exactly. That's true. Yeah, it does take input. So it's taking input in the form of key presses and mouse movements, and handling all that information, and also updates and rendering. There's lots of little tasks going on, which is actually quite applicable to AsyncIO. And it's not that crazy, actually, now that I think about it, because JavaScript has async and await. And that's used predominantly for user interfaces. So,
yeah, client side or whatever they call it.
Yeah. So I've taken the same approach when I'm implementing a TUI, and because people have used that same approach in the front end, clearly it's applicable.
So maybe we could describe, again, being a podcast, this sort of concept of like let's say a generic TUI text user interface. Like what would the components be, and what would make it up?
Do you mean from the sort of interface point of view or code?
Yeah, like the different separate windows and.
Well, it's not too dissimilar from a web page.
Okay.
In the sense, that I'm looking at Zencastr at the moment, and that has a side panel with some content that's chat, and it's got a header and some links, and it's got presumably a window which scrolls.
Mm-hmm.
I think the same kind of thing can be done in the terminal to create an interface. You divide the components of this screen up into logical bits and put content in each of those and build your interface that way. I think the only difference between, say, a GUI or a web application is that a TUI should be primarily keyboard.
Okay. Should be, keyboard input driven.
Yeah, I mean, it does...
Not mouse.
Exactly. It does do mouse, and a lot of people appreciate the mouse. Sometimes mouse is good for exploring an interface. But the whole point of a TUI is that you can go from typing in the terminal, you can launch a bigger UI, work on that UI with the keyboard, tap, 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 enter text, do what you have to do, and then exit the TUI, and then you're back to the terminal again. And I think that kind of workflow can be much quicker than launching a browser and navigating a browser, or even launching a desktop application.
Yeah, I feel like there are a lot of applications that are set up so that in order to interact with it beyond anything that's just a command line interface, which usually maybe has logging at most, in there, it's been a trend to kick it out to a small, locally hosted web app or something like that.
Yeah.
And this might be that nice kind of in between spot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That's exactly what I'm thinking. I think you build some functionality, and maybe you want a bit more of a user interface beyond just command line. And you could build a desktop application, or, as you suggested, a web application. But often the barrier to entry for doing that is large enough to just put you off.
Sure.
So I think that quite often people would decide they want a UI, but it never happens. So there's this niche, which I'm hoping that Textual will fit into. So you build your app with a command line interface, and then you spend 2 or 3 days, hopefully, implementing a TUI. And I'm hoping that a lot of projects will start to use that. And I'm thinking it'd be great if you're working with a command line interface and you just guess that you do --TUI to launch the TUI into it. If enough projects do that, I think it'll make life easier for a lot of developers and non-developers too. Yeah.
I was thinking about the different kind of components that can make up a TUI. Like, I'm looking at an example right now that you have where, it has a header that's like kind of a different color bar.
Yeah.
And then you have it just listed as a placeholder, which is just a side column. In those circumstances, you have like a using just text.
Yeah.
And I guess like a lot of special characters, you've created the outline around the box.
Yeah.
And then, centered the like some text on the side that would be, maybe it could be like instructions or some kind of like, the basic like commands that you would use.
Yeah.
But then you have like a top right hand upper box that is a little more like the command line in the sense that it would actually show like, potentially scrolling information that goes back to maybe the mouse interaction, that you could actually scroll the data back and forth.
Mm.
And then maybe at the bottom, there's like a footer that has a certain amount of information. And any of those could be like, David and I were talking about a text charting library.
Yeah.
That was kind of cool. And I'm like, oh, that could probably integrate into that pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm hoping to have lots of plotting built in.
Okay.
There are libraries which do this, which just write plots and graphs and things to the terminal, and they're usually pretty good. They have an x-axis and a y-axis, and they can draw a line to various means. You can do some clever things. You can use just block characters. You can also use dashes and lines. You can also use Braille characters.
Okay.
Which is a complete abuse of what they're intended for. But
yeah,
a Braille character is 2 by 3 dots, I believe. So if you treat those dots as pixels, you can build up an image with it that's characters, but it still seems more like a higher resolution image.
Yeah. Okay.
So those libraries exist and they're quite good. But what I'd like to do is pull that into Textual and allow you to scroll. So maybe you could click and drag on one of the axes to move left and right or up and down, or mouse wheel to zoom, that kind of thing.
A bit like some of the libraries like Bokeh or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But in terminal. Mm.
So yeah, and I was thinking about that. Like, not only can you scroll the windows, but it being, the whole thing is running in a terminal window typically, right?
Yeah.
And so that window itself is resizable. Was that difficult to have your code? I don't know where the difficult bits are as far as like, okay, you resize a window and now the amount of text space for each one of these windows is going to adjust.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a few layout systems.
Okay.
They're quite similar to GUIs. I think GUIs have very similar concepts, and also CSS.
Okay.
So you can divide the screen up into vertical and horizontal lines, and then place windows. Well, and textual, I call them widgets, but basically a window that goes from one vertical line to another, and then one horizontal line to another. So when the user resizes it repeats that process, and it divides the screen up into proportions. So you can have fixed sidebar, say 32 characters. Then the rest of the screen can be split into 4 equal proportions, and it would do that regardless of the screen size, whether you stretch it horizontally or vertically. It would still have the same overall format.
Yeah. So one of the, I don't know if this is more of a proof of concept. You'd done like a calculator.
Yeah. The calculator was to prove that CSS grid works in a terminal.
Okay.
So I'm a web guy generally, and I want to take CSS concepts like CSS grid, which is dividing up the width and the height into vertical and horizontal columns and putting windows between them. And I needed a good test for that. And I thought, well, calculator is a good test. I popped up the macOS calculator and observed how it's kind of a grid.
Yeah.
But I think the 0 button spans two squares, and at the top where the digits go, that spans the full width. And I started writing using the CSS grid-like system that I created. I plotted out the layout of that calculator, of the macOS calculator. I even took the dropper tool and used the same colors. It doesn't look quite as good as macOS, but it works as an actual calculator.
Yeah, that's nice. This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. With all our recent talk about making small Python projects, I thought this would be a great course to share, especially if you're interested in making a small game that you can easily complete. It's titled Rock, Paper, Scissors with Python, a command line game. The course is based on a Real Python article by Chris Wilkerson, and in the course, Christopher Trudeau shows you how to code your own rock, paper, scissors game, take in user input with the input function, play several games in a row using a while loop, clean up your code with enum objects and functions, and then define more complex rules with a dictionary, and then how to make an advanced version of the project that helps to avoid the common issue of repeated tie games. I think it's a worthy investment of your time to practice making a small game that runs in the command line. And this is a quick course to get you up and running, but also has multiple suggestions on how to enhance the game, where you'll practice iterating your code and refactoring. And like all the video courses on Real Python, the course is broken into easily consumable sections, and you get additional resources and code examples for the techniques shown. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the enhanced search tool on realpython.com. What were some of the harder points for it? You mentioned async. I don't know if that was difficult to integrate, but what were some of the parts that were challenging for you?
The tricky bits is managing the updates.
Okay.
So every component is a widget, and every widget has a message pump, which has a queue of messages which are being processed by an AsyncIO task. And a message can be an event like a key press. It can also be an event like the window resizing, etc. And in that system, when you resize the window, you've got to ask all these components to repaint their particular part of the screen. And that system is quite tricky because they're all sending their updates independently of each other. And the higher level object, the app in Textual, has to combine them to paint the entire screen. That was a tricky bit, but that's what most of the system is built on. It allows the components to be entirely independent.
Okay.
They don't call methods on each other, which is a bit weird when you're building applications in general, because you kind of expect to get an instance and call its methods. But in Textual, you pass messages. So you create a message object and you push it to the widget's message pump, and it processes it independently. But I'm glad to say that that's working now. That was quite tricky. There was a lot of hair pulling out, but it kind of works now.
It feels a bit like you have, some background in game development. You'd written a Pygame book a long time ago.
Yeah.
It sounds a bit like, creating a game loop of sorts, a sort of a loop that's always going to be running, checking for updates. Is that similar in some ways? I mean, it sounds like the messaging system is very different in that way.
It's a lot like a game, and I think that's one of the reasons that this project has appealed to me, because it uses muscles that have atrophied since I used to work in video games. I'm using some of the similar kind of concepts. I think the only major difference is Textual doesn't keep processing things in a tight loop like a video game, because a video game has to present 30, 60, 120 frames a second.
Always pushing the rate.
Yeah. But you don't want to do that with a terminal, because it just wastes CPU. You want, when you're doing nothing, for it to use 0% CPU. But interestingly, terminals these days, they're quite advanced. They use video game type technologies like hardware accelerated graphics to draw things to the screen. Some of them are using OpenGL and those kind of technologies. So they can actually push characters to the screen remarkably quickly.
Yeah.
So it's surprisingly close to video games. I mean, I was experimenting with how smooth can I animate something.
I was wondering about that.
Yeah, and it turns out 120 frames a second is fine.
Okay.
In the terminal, which I find crazy. It feels like when people write these TUIs, they're writing TUIs which might have needed to go at that rate like 20 years ago. And they haven't realized that the terminals have got so much faster.
Yeah. I would, it's, I don't know if it's neglected or not, but maybe it's just like the development's happening behind the scenes, and, the team that's probably behind the terminal application is maybe small within like an OS vendor. But are there other third-party terminals? You mentioned to me before we started that you're on the Mac platform, but are you having to test this out on, like, say, different Windows terminals and things like that?
So there's no Windows support yet.
Okay.
Because it will need a different kind of driver. There's different ways of getting the keyboard and such.
Okay.
But it's designed so that I will be able to build it on later.
So it's Unix and Mac then currently?
It is for now. Yeah. Okay. Windows drivers will come along eventually, but for now it's Linux and Mac.
Okay.
But to go back to your question, I do have a small, actually quite a large array of terminals that run on Mac OS.
Okay.
I'm just looking at, I've got the Mac OS terminal, I've got iTerm, I've got Kitty, Hyper, Alacrity, and a few others. And of course, I want to test it and make sure it runs on them. In theory, it should, because most of them are Xterm compatible. But I have noticed subtle differences. It's just the nature of, I guess. But as long as I test it on quite a large variety of terminals.
I'm wondering what kind of bugs pop up in those circumstances.
It's usually, see, the spec for terminals, it's hard to express how old it is.
Okay.
Because it's multiple layers. It's like when we say the word terminal, what we're actually referring to is a terminal emulator.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Which makes you wonder, what the heck is it emulating then? And it turns out it's old machines from like the 70s where you've got like a tiny screen and a big keyboard, but that's connected to a remote computer.
Right. It's sort of the original sort of shared experience, right?
Yeah. It's how your grandparents use computers. But it goes back even further than that, because those machines are electronic versions of teletype machines.
Okay.
Which were essentially, obviously it's way before my time, way before your time as well. It's a printer attached to a keyboard. So when you type, you don't see it on the screen. You see it on a printer.
Yeah.
Anyway, the reason I launched into that was because the protocol that we have today is been layered on since way back then, way back from the 1950s. Every manufacturer has added a little bit to the protocol, and the terminal emulators today have all these instructions. Oh, a subset actually, but they go back very far. So the problem is that I think there's different interpretations of the standard. So there's some subtle differences, and of course bugs. The terminals are generally not that buggy because lots of people using them. Any real bugs would hopefully rise to the surface. but I have noticed some subtle differences that I can work around.
Okay. Yeah, it's little stuff creeping up here and there.
Yeah.
What was some of the stuff that you were like most excited to include into Textual?
I think it was smooth scrolling. Spent a lot of time working on scroll bars. The scroll bars are rendered with Unicode characters. This Unicode characters which represent blocks, and they go from 1/8 block to a quarter block to a full block, and you can render a high resolution bar that you can scroll up. It looks almost pixel perfect. It's not quite, but it's quite smooth.
Nice.
Yeah, and I added there's quite a lot to a scroll bar. Lots of pieces of functionality. You use them in the web or in the GUI so often that you just forget about it. But there's lots of interactions, like where you can click and drag. Obviously, you can click above and below the scroll bar. You can do page down, page up. Lots of ways of interacting with the scroll bar. So I spent quite a lot of time putting those in. And the reason I did that was because I would like TUI to be usable by the layman.
Right.
I'd like to be able to give a TUI to your Joe Bloggs who's never opened a terminal and have them completely at ease with using that interface.
Yeah, especially if it's geared toward a dashboard type of thing.
Yeah.
The person may not be interacting with it a lot, but they should at least feel comfortable with like updating it, or especially some of the things you mentioned of like potentially like zooming or scrolling and so forth. That,
yeah,
I mean, the point of a dashboard, in my opinion, is more than just to look at it, is to interact with it.
Yeah, exactly. And if the dashboard gets more sophisticated, I would like people to be at home. So if I'm not a developer, I might use it thinking, well, this app has a certain kind of retro aesthetic, but it's exactly what I'm familiar with.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. Are there particular uses that you are looking forward to people doing with it?
Sure. Yeah. There's a certain number of sweet spots with these type of applications, which I think people may build with it first. What I can think of is quite a lot of tasks I do on servers to administer them. That's not my main job. I'm a software developer, but most of them involve hunting for a configuration file, editing that configuration file, and then running a process and seeing the results. So I can imagine an interface where on the left, you've got a tree view or a list view of all the various configuration files that you might need for whatever your project is doing. You click on one of those, it opens that configuration file in an editor, and at some point there will be a fully featured editor, textual, the syntax highlighted. So they go in there, they edit their configuration file, and then they might hit a button which launches the process, and then I can show the results of that process in a panel which appears at the bottom of the screen or something, and they can use that to administer their web server or whatever application they're using.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. That nice set of controls on one side that, where you're able to sort of select and choose and not have to leave the screen. Yeah.
Not have to hunt around at the command line and remember the paths and then launch your editor. It's not a killer app in that sense. People already do this quite successfully. But I think if it just makes it easier, people will always use the easier option. So I'm hoping that people will take that and build their own little TUI. Hopefully just 2 or 3 days work. I mean, if I provide a framework where you don't have to reinvent everything from scratch, you can just add your own configuration files and define what happens when you click the go button, that kind of thing. So I'm hoping that people will take that and use that.
Yeah, cool.
I'm always keen to talk about it. So if any readers want to contact me, then quite happy to go over anything really.
Yeah, so I was thinking maybe we could get into talking about some changes in your career lately.
Yeah.
So you made kind of an announcement recently.
That's right. So I'm basically I've been a freelance developer for a number of years. I've decided to take a year off. It might be a year. It might be slightly less, but I've planned for a year, and in that time, I'd like to develop Textual and also work on other open source projects. The reason I'm doing this is because I do think there might be commercial applications for textual in the future, but that doesn't take anything away from the fact that I'm sort of building an open source project for the benefit of the community.
Yeah.
And I'd also like to try and be a friend to open source in general, because I've been the beneficiary of open source code all my career. So I'd kind of like to contribute some work and time to other open source projects and see what good I can do in that period of time.
Do you have your eyes on any particular projects at the moment?
There's a few at the top of my head. I wouldn't mind contributing to HTTPX. I'll have a look and see if they've got any. I mean, I could a few things I could add to their command line application using Rich, but it's not purely about Rich. It's anything really. I'm looking for ideas actually, so I'm hoping people will contact me and say, "Is there anything you could you do this for me or help me?" Or that kind of thing. I was also thinking of doing code reviews for other open source projects, because I do that in a day job. And if I build up a number of code reviews, I can get better at that and maybe publish them on GitHub.
To take that as a little tangent, what are things that you think make up a good code review? Like what are things that need to be like included in that?
I guess not focusing on the minutiae of the code, not formatting. I mean, hopefully they're using black, so it might not be an issue, but not the little details that they're important on some level, but you don't need someone to do a code review to find those. I'm hoping I can focus on design issues, designing APIs. I have experience doing that, and if I can nudge projects in a different direction they might not have thought about before, hopefully that'll be quite beneficial.
Yeah. Do you feel like it's a mutually beneficial experience doing code review?
Yeah, I think so. I think the more code reviews that I do, the better I'll get, better idea of other people's code that I have. So it is kind of mutually beneficial. And also the reason I want to get better at it is because I would also like to do it at some point, basically on a paid level, for non-open source projects.
Okay.
Maybe commercial projects, they could come to me and ask me to review the code and offer any suggestions for improvements to APIs and interfaces and that kind of thing.
So a bit of a like consulting on that level.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Before this break, were you working as a freelance? That was what was on your blog before. I was just trying to make sure that that's still the title that you had at the time, freelance developer.
Yeah, that's right. I was a freelance developer. I was working for the same client actually for 10 plus years.
Okay.
And we've done some cool things together. But I think this is just about the right time in my life to give something of my own a try.
Yeah. So you have set up sort of GitHub sponsors. Is that the right name?
GitHub sponsors. That's right. Yeah. So since I won't have an income for quite a while, possibly up to a year, I was looking to get sponsors through GitHub sponsors. If I help you with open source in any way, if I contribute, maybe you could return the favor with a small donation. Not required, but it would certainly be very much appreciated because it would really help pay the bills.
Yeah, and you have different kind of levels of engagement that people can look at there too to kind of get an idea of the types of things that you'd be interested in helping with.
Yeah, so GitHub sponsors has a few tiers. You choose a larger sponsorship and you can get some perks back. But in general, if you're an open source project, I would like to help you.
Yeah, cool.
Sponsorship isn't required on any level. I don't want people to think that. If it benefits the community, then I would love to contribute.
So currently Textual is a version 0.1.11. And I'm always intrigued by the zero version thing. I had the creator of Flask on and we talked about it for a little bit. Is there a particular reason that you'd like to keep it at zero ver for a bit?
Yeah, so there's still lots to do. I enumerated all the tasks I need to do. I put it in GitHub projects. They've got a Kanban board.
Okay.
And added things to my to-do column, and there's so much left to do. Keeping it at version 0 means that the interface is provisional, in that I can change it at a later date. I don't want to do that because I might break people's code, but I'm saying, sorry, I might have to do it.
If something comes along.
Yeah.
Okay.
When it reaches 1.0, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's complete. In fact, it probably isn't. But when I get to 1.0, I'm saying this interface is stable.
Okay.
And you can rely on backwards compatibility. But for the moment, I might break your code on the next version. So if you do use Textual, please pin your version numbers to the specific version down to the third digit.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah, it's good advice. So I have these weekly questions I like to ask everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And the first one is, what's something that you're excited about that's happening in the world of Python? Could be like an event or a book or package or what have you.
It's actually, there's a move on to make Python faster.
Yeah.
I know when this comes up, standard answer from Python developers is, well, it doesn't need to be faster. Most of the projects are IO bound, and there are ways of you can run multiprocessing and things to make it go faster. But let's face it, we would all want Python to run faster. And I think there's a lot of interest in this. There's a working group, I think it's headed by Guido van Rossum, and they're looking into ways of making Python just faster. And that will benefit everyone in a wide variety of projects.
Yeah.
It's obviously a very tricky deal, Python go faster. I mean, I've been watching lots of projects that have exactly that goal. Some of them come and go. They attempt it and they don't get as fast as they intend them to. And some have pros and cons. It might go faster, but might use up more memory, or be less stable. So, like PyPy. PyPy's terrific. When I tried it, this was a few years ago, so apologies if things are better. I used up too much memory. Hopefully it's better now, but if we can get the regular Python interpreter just faster, 10%, 20%, I think they're aiming for 3 times faster or something.
Yeah.
I think that would be very exciting.
Yeah, we did a episode where I talked to Joanna Jablonski, and she was able to basically be the reporter at the Language Summit.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were lots of interesting talks in that direction. And even the version that's coming out in a few weeks here is in the numbers that you mentioned, it's like, I think at least 20-25% faster, depending on what you're trying to do, if not more. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting times. So.
Yeah. And I wonder if it might change the type of things which are done with Python. Because when you're choosing a language, it is a big factor for some things. The other more static or compiled languages, they are faster, and you might not look at Python because you think it's slow. But what if Python got faster? So maybe that speed doesn't make much of a difference. It might open up whole new avenues for Python developers.
Yeah, and there's so many avenues as it is to see it even open up more would be great.
Yeah.
Cool. What's something that you want to learn next?
Oh, that's a good one, because I do have a year off. And I don't want to be entirely about code. I probably won't get this opportunity again in my life. So I should do something interesting with it. And the thing I want to do is writing.
Okay.
I've always had this idea that I would like to write a novel. I know a lot of people do. They don't get the time to do it. And I figured when I'm not writing Python, I can try write a novel. I do a bit of writing. I'm not very good. I think it might be something that takes a while to learn.
Yeah,
so,
I think it's very an iterative process.
Yeah, I wasn't born being able to write Python. It took quite a while to learn. So I think it's probably the same for writing prose. But that's definitely something that I'd like to learn. Yeah.
Are there resources you're using to hone those tools?
Just reading.
Okay.
Basically, I think reading is a good way to learn writing. When I read now, I kind of I'm more analytical.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, how did they express that idea? How did they launch into the dialogue? How did they connect the scenes? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I can imagine you doing that with photography, being that some of your background, that you could look at another photographer's work and have those same kind of questions pop up.
Yeah. Like, how did they do it? How did they make something look so good? Or
right.
How did that writer do so well? And try to figure out plotting. I think plotting for me, is probably the hardest thing. I can construct a sentence, which I think is quite readable, or even an entire paragraph. But how you come up with an intricate story from start to finish, that's it's beyond me at the moment. But that is something I need to research and figure out.
Yeah, I listen to lots of audiobooks. I think maybe that's my own little problem of like trying to read prose has always been very slow for me. But I really enjoyed Stephen King's On Writing book. I don't know if you checked that.
Yeah, I read that a while ago. Yeah, I must reread it because it always gets recommended when people talk about writing. Yeah, it's
very interesting, and he's so prolific.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Could learn a thing or two from Stephen King, definitely.
Yeah, sure. So we kind of end up each episode with shout outs or plugs and anything that you want to promote.
I guess my GitHub sponsorships.
Okay.
But if you look at my projects, Textual and Rich, I'm sure there'll be links in the show notes.
Yep.
So yeah, I'd love people to check those out, comment them, give me suggestions, because for Textual, it's really important that I satisfy everyone's use case. So please check that out, run the examples, and comment on the discussions board. That'd be fantastic.
And then are there particular social connections you want to share?
There's my Twitter. I'm quite a prolific Twitterer these days. So feel free to follow me and tweet. I like interacting with Python developers. So yeah, have a look at my Twitter.
All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. This has been great.
Thank you. It's been great. I've enjoyed it.
All right. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And don't forget, this episode was sponsored by DataStax Astra DB, built on Apache Cassandra, made easy in the cloud. Learn more at astra.dev/Python. I want to thank Will McGugan for coming on the show. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and look forward to talking to you soon.